Let's open with prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you for your continued goodness, loving kindness and tender mercies. As we continue the study of your word, we pray that you would guide our thoughts and our feelings, that we would continue to honour and glorify your name in all that we do and say. Give us wisdom and understanding, for we ask for this blessing in the name of Jesus. Amen.
Amen.
At the end of our last study, we had some technical difficulties and we were forced to cut short the study and essentially race through. So I wanted to just go over the last 30 minutes or so, perhaps a little bit more, of the previous presentation, so that we can really grasp how history is going to repeat in a much clearer and concise fashion. So the schematics that we've got on our screen is basically what was presented in our last presentation. So I'm going to go over what we discussed previously. But to get a better understanding of how this information was developed, you'll need to review the material that was presented previously. So what we did was we looked at a timeline, and this timeline is based upon the visions of Daniel 2, Daniel 7, Daniel 8, Daniel 11. But it's not the complete timeline for those visions, it's only a portion of those timelines. So we got this timeline and we divided it into 3 segments. The first segment was pagan Rome. The second segment was papal Rome, and the third segment we used the term modern papal Rome. In the language of Daniel chapter 2, this is the legs and this is the feet of iron and clay. So this would be the feet and toes, and this would be the legs. Daniel chapter 7 is somewhat more complex, because in Daniel chapter 7 you clearly see this portion, the fourth beast, which was diverse from the others, or the iron beast, and you can clearly see the little horn, which was diverse from the 10 horns that were before it. But this one isn't so easy to see in Daniel 7. Likewise, in Daniel chapter 8, this portion of the timeline is very easy to see. This is a little horn of Daniel chapter 8, but this portion isn't so well understood. Likewise in Daniel chapter 9. In Daniel chapter 11, we come back to this complete timeline again, as it does in Daniel chapter 2, and we see pagan Rome being discussed, papal Rome being discussed, and then modern Rome being discussed. So in the language of Daniel chapter 11, pagan Rome is discussed from verse 14 to around verse 30. You might pick up verse 16, but verse 14 to verse 30. Then papal Rome is verse 31 to 39, and modern papal Rome is verse 40 to 45. And as many of us who are listening to this presentation are aware, there is heated discussion on the correct interpretation of Daniel chapter 11 verses 40 to 45, which deal with this component of the timeline. Now, as I said in our previous study, the reason why we're discussing this, history 1, history 2, is to understand what's going to happen in the day and age in which we're living. And to understand what our history is, I'm suggesting that we need to go back into these previous histories so that we can make application for ourselves today. Now we've got pagan, papal and modern papal, but all of this is the history of Rome. All of this is the fourth kingdom of Daniel chapter 2. So already taking a small portion, a quarter if you like, of the vision of Daniel chapter 2 and expanding that. And as I say, Daniel chapter 11, the majority of the chapter deals with these three segments of history. And these three histories are discussed in the book of Revelation at length. Revelation 12, 13, 17 and 18 all discuss these three histories. So looking at these three timelines, what we've done is we've broken this timeline up into three different segments. So this is what I've done. So you can see we've broken it into three segments. Instead of having a continuum, we've taken three discrete segments, and it's not to imply that there's a gap between the two, because there isn't, but I've broken these three down. And then what we've done in this segment of this board is we've taken these histories and we've dropped them underneath this history. So I took papal Rome, dropped it under pagan, and then took modern papal Rome and dropped it under papal Rome. So in essence we have this. That's what I've done. So this one here went here, and this one here went there. So can you all see that's what we're doing. So this here 1, 2, 2, 3 is 1, 2 and 3. So I'll put 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, so that we're all clear what we're talking about. So I've taken these timelines, dropped them one underneath the other, and given quite a bit of detail in these three timelines. The reason why we want to do that is because when we begin to lay them, if you like, one on top of the other or one under the other, we begin to see that they're all following the same pattern. And then it's this understanding that they're following the same pattern that when we come to the third history, this one labelled number 3, this one here, we can then begin to make a correct application of the history in which we're living. Unless you do this, it's very difficult to know if you're making a correct application of prophetic information when you're trying to shoot or you're trying to understand prophecy both in its present fulfillment and its future fulfillment. Most of us will be aware, if you see what many other Christians are saying, it's very difficult to understand prophecy correctly and make future or present applications. There's a lot of misunderstanding. So what I'm suggesting is it's by a correct understanding of past histories that we can see a pattern forming so that we can understand our own history. So that's the technique or the prophetic rule of interpretation that we're using. So this, as I said, this is all review. So the first history is pagan Rome, second history was papal Rome, and the third history is modern papal Rome, and it's this history that we're interested in. It's this history that we're interested in. And if you recall at the beginning of the previous presentation, and that presentation was divided into two segments, part 1 and part 2, I listed down 4 things that we wanted to discuss. And briefly what they composed of, those 4 areas of investigation, what they really boiled down to were to understand why pagan Rome came to its end, how papal Rome came to its end, why they came to their end. so that we can understand what's going to go on in our history, and also who and what were the forces that brought down these powers. So if we go to pagan Rome, what we find, and this here, this 1, 2, 3, is really collapsed into this single event at the beginning. So here you could have 1, 2, 3, like so. I've given the 3 events that lead up to pagan Rome ruling the world supremely. Now this history here, these 3 events, are discussed in Daniel chapter 8, verse 9. Daniel chapter 8, verse 9. You'll notice that on the board here, I've put the events in historical order. In Daniel chapter 8, verse 9, they're not given in historical order. So let's turn in our Bibles to Daniel 8. Daniel chapter 8, verse 9, and it reads, "And out of one of them came forth a little horn." So this is the little horn that I mentioned. This is pagan Rome, which waxed exceeding great toward the south and toward the east and toward the pleasant land. Before I make comment on that verse, I just want to explain to everybody who's listening, is that if you refer back, and I believe it should be on the website, to the studies that have been conducted on Daniel chapter 8, where we go into the proof to confirm that Daniel 8 verse 9 is indeed pagan Rome, and how we go about interpreting all this symbology in the chapter, which I'm not going to go over now. So I'm going with the assumption that in verse 9 the little horn is pagan Rome, and it says it waxes exceeding great toward the south, toward the east and toward the pleasant land. So what I've put here, I've put, and this is in historical order, the east, the glorious land, and Egypt. And Egypt is referring to the south that it mentions in the verse, and the east actually historically is Syria, and the glorious land is Israel. So if I put, I've already given the date for Egypt, 31 BC. This is the Battle of Actium. I'll give you the other dates. The east, or Syria, is taken in 64 BC. The glorious land is taken in 63 BC. And both 64 and 63, the east, Syria, and the glorious land, Israel, were conquered in the same campaign by General Pompey. Most people have heard of Pompeii, the city of Pompeii that got destroyed by a volcano. It was named after a famous Roman general called General Pompey. In his campaign to subdue the eastern part of the empire, he took and subdued Syria, and then he subdued Israel at the same time. So they're the 3 dates, but the important date to understand is 31 BC, because in 31 BC at the Battle of Actium, pagan Rome had conquered 3 territories, and these 3 territories are the 3 territories that are mentioned, as I said, in verse 9. And then all the obstacles being subdued to its ruling supremely, pagan Rome began to rule for 360 years in agreement with the prophecy of Daniel 11 verse 24. Now again,
For how many years?
360 years. So again, I'm not going to exegesis verse 24, but it says he shall. Let's read the verse together. I'm just going to read the last portion of the verse. It says, "Yea, and he shall forecast his devices against the strongholds, even for a time." The person that's been spoken about, the he, in this verse, Daniel 11 verse 24, is pagan Rome. And it's talking about the history when it warred from its stronghold, the city of Rome, for a time. And in Bible prophecy, a time is representative of a year, and a year in prophecy is 360 days. And so we find that Rome's going to rule supremely from its strongholds. The verse says against, but it should be translated from its strongholds for 360 years. So if you go from 31 BC and go 360 years into the future, you get to 330 AD. 330 AD. 330 AD is an important year because in 330 AD, the emperor of Rome, who was Constantine, leaves the city of Rome and transplants his seat, the throne of his empire, from the city of Rome and moves it to a backwater city, and he develops a new centre and he names it Constantinople. So Constantinople, which is today called Istanbul, begins to be formed in 330 AD when Constantine leaves the city of Rome. So pagan Rome rules supremely for one time, that's why you've got one time, which is 360 years, from 31 BC to 330 AD. During this time period, in the year 321 AD, Constantine, the same empire, makes a national Sunday law. He becomes a Christian and he makes a national Sunday law imposing Sunday observance, and he does that in 321 AD, and that's the important thing that we discussed in our previous study. So moving on to the second timeline, number 2, Papal Rome, this one, which I've moved underneath, we find that Papal Rome follows the same pattern or sequence of events that pagan Rome does. So for Papal Rome to come to rule supremely, it too takes down 3 powers. Now the 3 powers that it takes down, we've got 1, 2, 3, is discussed in Daniel chapter 7, which I think we're all familiar with. So in Daniel chapter 7, there's this 4th beast, this iron beast, which is different from all the other beasts. It has 10 horns in its head, and I want to reiterate again that these 10 horns are in its head, thereby confirming at a prophetic level that the 10 horns and the beast are one in the same thing. The 10 horns and the beast are one in the same thing. They both represent pagan Rome. Okay? Both historically, geographically and politically, they're all part of pagan Rome. From those 10 horns, it says amongst them, or in the midst of them, but coming up after them, a little horn rises. And this little horn that rises is Papal Rome. And then it says, before whom 3 of the first were plucked up. So those 3 were plucked up before him. And you get this imagery in your mind that the little horn, he's standing here, and before him, in front of him, at his behest, 3 of those horns are plucked up. And indeed that's what history confirms, that 3 horns, 3 of those powers, which were a component of pagan Rome, were plucked up by the roots, were destroyed and annihilated. Now those 3 powers that were destroyed were the Heruli, the Vandals and the Ostrogoths. They're the 3 powers that the papacy destroyed. Now it doesn't destroy it because it's got inherent power in and of itself, but it has to get someone else to do the battling or the destroying for it. And we discussed this at some length, so I'm not going to go over it again. But essentially, the destruction of these three powers is done by pagan Rome. Pagan Rome destroys these three powers on behalf of the papacy. I'll mention it here before we move on. In Revelation chapter 8 and chapter 9, and we discussed this in our previous presentation, so this is just recapping, that Revelation chapter 8 and chapter 9 deal with the 7 trumpets. Now we made a really simple application of what the trumpets were. The trumpets are a tool, in a singular sense, a tool that God uses to punish Rome. That's essentially what a trumpet is. A trumpet is a tool that God uses to punish Rome. Now, Rome is punished by the trumpet for a very specific reason. And the reason is for making National Sunday laws. So when Rome makes the National Sunday law, God imposes or brings a trumpet upon it. So it's a really simple understanding of what a trumpet is. The only reason we mention that now, at this stage, is because these 3 horns here, which were part of the 10 of Daniel chapter 7, if you go into Revelation chapter 8, we don't need to turn there now, but Daniel chapter 8 talks about 4 trumpets. 3 of those trumpets are these 3 horns. So the 3 horns that were plucked up in Daniel chapter 7 are actually 3 of the trumpets that God brings to punish Rome. So on one level, pagan Rome destroys these 3 horns for the papacy, on one level, and on another level, pagan Rome comes to destroy these 3 horns because these 3 horns were actually 3 of the trumpets that came and warred against pagan Rome. So they were taking a revengeful act upon these 3 horns. So you can already see that the trumpets are beginning to have some bearing upon the events of history that we're talking about. So the last horn here, and I've given it in historical order, is actually brought down in the year 538 AD. In the year 538 AD. Then Rome rules supremely, and it rules for 3.5 times supremely. 3.5 times, or 3.5 prophetic years, which is 1260 years. I want to add this point in because it's going to come up in future studies, and I've mentioned it in previous ones too, that the most important time prophecy in the Bible, bar none, is this time prophecy here. The 1260 years is the most important time prophecy, because God doesn't repeat himself unless he has a very specific reason. Most of the time when God wants to make a point, he'll make the point twice. He'll make the point twice, because upon a testimony of 2 or 3, but upon testimony of 2 a thing is established. So when God wants to establish something, he makes the point by referring to this point twice. An example of that, in fact a very good example of that, is what the chart that we've developed here. 1 and 2, something is established. We begin to see an establishment of a pattern. And so you can begin to understand that when Rome begins to rise again, it's going to follow the same pattern, because it's following the rule that upon the testimony of 2 something is established. So we could say 1, 2, 3, and we could say 1, and if I were to put a plus there and it equals there, we could say 1 plus 2 equals 3. That's a really neat way of thinking about it. Okay, so I could put 1 plus 2 equals 3. So if you want to find out what the answer is, you just go and add these 2 together. But the 1260 doesn't come up twice in the scriptures. It doesn't come up 3 times, 4 times, not even 5. It comes 7 times. Now you have to ask yourself the question, why does this prophecy come up 7 times? And even on its most superficial level, we could suggest that that this time prophecy is a perfect time prophecy, because the number 7 is a perfect, okay? But there's more to that. Number 7 is not just a number of perfection, you know, because it's the 7th-day Sabbath. God created the world in 7 days, you know, obviously in 6 days, but the 7th day He rested. So this cycle of 7 comes up over and over again. There's a sabbatical cycle, there's the Jubilee cycle, there's the weekly cycle, there's the Sabbath. This cycle comes up over and over again. But now there's a lot of argumentation and discussion about Leviticus 10:26 when it says, I'm going to punish you 7 times. You may or may not have heard of this argument or this discussion. Now the reason why I mention that is not because I want to particularly discuss that, but if you look at the context of the way I'm going to punish you 7 times that's used in Leviticus 26, if you look at the root word that's used there, this root word of 7 times actually means it's an oath. This 7 times, because although we say 7 times in the English is 2 words, it's actually 1 word. So God is actually saying, I'm going to seven you. If you were to take it in a literal sense, He says, I'm going to seven you. Now when you say this, I'm going to seven you, He's not saying I'm going to punish you 7 or anything like that. And I'm not talking about how we understand the verse, I'm talking about in its definition. He says, I'm going to seven you. And this 7, if you look at its meaning, means it's an oath. So He says, I'm going to promise. So this number 7, the word 7, actually has a connotation not only of perfection, but also of an oath, also of a promise. Now we know that all the prophets only spoke really for those people who lived at the end of the world. Yeah, they're writing more for our time and not their own. So when it comes to this 3.5 times, which is 7 times, I would suggest that God in this is not only saying, you know, this is a perfect time prophecy, but He's making some kind of oath. He's making some kind of promise. So we'd have to ask ourselves, why is He making this promise here? The reason why this is important is because if you look at this timeline, we can see, and most of us have realised this, that the 3.5 times works out at 1,260. In fact, the scriptures talk about it. It says 1,203 score days, 42 months, times and a half, times, and the dividing of time. That's how this prophecy is worded. This was 1260, and I'll just put that this was 360, and we know it finishes in 1798. Now what happens in 1798? We all know what happens in 1798. Okay, we have what we refer to the deadly wound. Okay, the deadly wound is inflicted. I will state here that this time period, we call it the Dark Ages. We also call it the time of the wilderness. Depending on the context or the connotation that we want to bring up, it has many different names. But this 1260 is a historical date. It ends in 1798. So what is the oath or the promise that God is trying to convey to His people? I'm not going to answer that now, but the reason why I'm labouring on that point is that I'm suggesting that there's a reason that this time prophecy comes up more than 7 times. Sorry, it comes up more than once, more than twice, because you only need it twice to establish it, but it comes up 7 times. Okay, and it's not just the issue of perfection, but it's the issue of an oath that God is making. And I think that has bearing upon God's people at the end of the world. The most commentaries, in fact, all the commentaries that I've ever read, even if you go into Spirit of Prophecy, this time prophecy is always dealt with on a historical level. Please don't misunderstand me. We're not trying to take time prophecies and make future applications. That's not what I'm trying to suggest that we do. But what I am suggesting is that this may well indeed have application or bearing upon God's people at the end. In fact, we already know that it does, in the sense that this pattern and this pattern, 1 plus 2, is equal in 3. So we know that the format of what's going on here has some bearing upon us. Okay? But I'm further suggesting that this time prophecy is an oath that God is making to somebody. Now, He's made this oath to the people who lived in this dispensation, for sure. Daniel chapter 9 teaches us that. We know that Daniel 9 teaches us that. But I believe that there's more light in this time prophecy, and God is talking to us in some shape or form. So I'm going to just leave that point there. I don't want to get distracted on this study, because it's a study in and of itself. And this, as I said last week, is just a superficial overview of what's going on, and that's why we're not even referring to so many Bible verses. It's just an overview so that we can get a structural understanding of things that are going to be relevant to us in our day and age. So we've got pagan Rome has to take down 3 territories before it can rule supremely. It rules for a time which is 360 years, which ends in 330 AD. And there's a Sunday law that comes up in its history. Papal Rome follows exactly the same pattern. It has to take down 3 territories before it can begin to rule supremely. When it does, it rules for 3.5 times, which ends in 1798. Papal Rome too makes a Sunday law. The Sunday law that Papal Rome makes is at the beginning of the time in which it rules. It's at the beginning. In 538, it makes a national Sunday law, and then begins to rule. You can see that in pagan Rome, the Sunday law is formed towards the end, but in Papal Rome's history, it's formed right at the beginning. So we want to make application of these 2 histories to our own time. Based upon these 2 previous histories, and we know that Rome never changes, but modern Papal Rome, when it begins to rise to rule supremely, it's going to have to follow the same structure or the same sequence of events, the same pattern. And it's this understanding that I'm suggesting gives us the guidance or the framework to make the correct interpretation of the books of Daniel and Revelation. Without that, it's very hard to understand what the rise and fall of Papal Rome in the end of the world is going to look like. So, in agreement with what I've said, in the 3rd history, if you turn to Daniel chapter 11 verses 40 to 45, specifically verses 40 to 43, you will see that there are 3 powers that are discussed that the king of the north takes down. Let's turn to Daniel 11 and just quickly review that. So in Daniel 11, I'm not going to read all the verses, but we're going to be looking at verses 40 to 43. So the first verse we're looking at, verse 40, deals with number 1. Verse 41 deals with number 2. And verses 42 and 43 deal with number 3. So we've got 1, 2, 3, and it's going to be verse 40, verse 41, and then verses 42 and 43. So if that's clear, let's let's look at verse 40. Verse 40 covers quite a bit of history, which I don't want to confuse us with, but I will make note of it. If you don't understand the point, I'm not going to develop it, but I'm just going to make observation to it. So let's go to verse 40. It says, "And at the time of the end shall the king of the south push at him." Now the time of the end is the end of this time prophecy that's mentioned in this history number 2. At the end of the 1260, at the time of the end, something's going to happen. So the time of the end that's being discussed in verse 40 is 1798. In 1798 it says that the king of the south is going to push at him. The him that's being referred to is the king of the north, which in this verse is actually papal Rome. And the king of the south, in verse 40, this part that's been spoken of here, the king of the south is actually France. It's atheistic France, and we can make application of that when we look at Revelation chapter 11. Revelation chapter 11, talking about atheistic France, it says it is Sodom and spiritually Egypt. Talking about atheistic France. So this king of the south is the king that rules the south, which is the land of Egypt, Egypt is the south, which is the point we made here. But it calls it the king of the south. It doesn't use the term Egypt. King of the south. Then, after that, it says, there's a colon, it says, and the king of the north shall come against him. So there's a role reversal. First, France comes against the papacy in 1798, and then it says that the papacy is going to come against him at some future date. Now, there is broad agreement amongst the brethren that this history that's been discussed in verse 40 is the warfare between the papacy and the Soviet Union, the USSR. This battle ensued between the years 1989 and 1991, and the figurehead event for that occurred in 1989 at the fall of the Berlin Wall, and that's the kind of the memory that most people have of that historical era. When the Berlin Wall fell, people knew that the Soviet Union had begun its collapse. And so this war between the king of the north and king of the south ends up between the war between the papacy and the Soviet Union. And then it says the papacy, when it brings war against the Soviet Union, it uses some help. It uses ships, chariots and horsemen. So it uses chariots, horsemen and ships. It uses these things. Now, chariots and horsemen refer to military power, and ships refer to economic power. So the papacy is going to be using economic and military power to come against this king of the south. The historical fulfillment of that is when papal Rome, the papacy, used an army, as it did at the beginning of its history here, to help it in its warfare, to bring down the obstacles that were confronting it. And in verse 40, the symbology of the chariot, horsemen and ships refers to the United States of America when it aided the papacy in its warfare against the Soviet Union. So here we've got the first power that's brought down is the king of the south, which is the USSR. So I'll write the USSR here. And then in verse 41 it says, he, king of the north, the papacy, shall enter also into the glorious land. So I'm not going to dwell on that verse, but to say it mentions the glorious land. The glorious land is the second power that's taken down. It says it clearly in the verse. Then verse 42 says, he shall stretch forth his hand also upon the countries, and the land of Egypt shall not escape. And so here in the third territory it mentions Egypt. Okay, and then look what happens in verse 43. But he shall have power over the treasures of gold and of silver, and over all the precious things of Egypt, and the Libyans and the Ethiopians shall be at his steps. Now I would suggest that this symbology of Egypt at the end of the world is referring to the world. Verse 42 actually says he stretches forth his hand also upon the countries. Then it uses this word, the land of Egypt shall not escape. And when he has all the precious things of Egypt, and he's taken the land, it then says at the bottom of verse 43, it says, and the Libyans and the Ethiopians shall be at his steps. Now these Libyans and Ethiopians represent the rich and the poor, and they also represent military strength. So as in verse 40, when warring against its enemies, the papacy uses military and economic strength, it does the same when it comes to its complete fulfillment. It uses the military strength of the rich and poor nations, and it has all the wealth of the rich and poor nations, because it says in the verse, it has power over all the treasures. So at stage one, it uses the military and economic power of the United States to bring down the confederacy of the USSR. It does that. But when it gets to the end, when it's taken down the third territory, and now it's going to rule supremely, and by definition, to rule supremely means it's going to rule the world, because this is a worldwide event, it must then have the military strength of the whole world and the economic strength of the whole world, which is what verse 43 tells you that it has. So what we've shown is that at the end of the world, modern papal Rome has to take down 3 territories, and when it's done taking down the third one, it's now ruling supremely. So here we see it's ruling supremely, and it's followed the same sequence: 1, 2, 3. 3 powers have to be taken down. But I want to make one point on this. Let's look at this a bit carefully here. King of the South, glorious land in Egypt. When we looked here, we had the east, the glorious land, and Egypt, which was the south. Now the USSR is actually known by another name. It's known as the Soviet Bloc, or the Eastern Bloc, the Eastern Bloc countries. We already use that terminology now, Eastern Europe. So look, the King of the South, another word for it is the East. So we have the East, the glorious land, and Egypt is the south. So the sequence of events from 1, 2 and 3, I'll put it here: East, glorious land, south. And in pagan Rome's history, look at the sequence: East, glorious land, and south. Now when Jesus calls himself the Alpha and the Omega, you begin to see what he means. Because how he started is how he finishes. The pattern is identical, the sequence is identical. First the east, then the glorious land, then the south. First the east, then the glorious land, then the south. The sequence is the same. So, modern Rome is ruling, and it's going to rule for a certain amount of time. We don't know the time period. And then, close of probation is going to occur. And I'm going to just mark this as Daniel 12:1. But note here, when it came to the beginning of papal Rome's history, it made its Sunday law at the beginning. Yeah? It made its Sunday law at the beginning. Pagan Rome made its Sunday law at the end, towards the end of its history, and this makes it towards the beginning. Now, it gets a bit complicated here, and this chart does not show it very well, but I'm going to try and explain that to us, if I can. Now, again, as I said, there's much discussion on the interpretation of these verses. But my understanding of these verses is in verse 41 it says, he shall enter into the glorious land. This entering into the glorious land is the national Sunday law that occurs in the United States, which is the first country that implements the national Sunday law, and then it enters into Egypt. It says it enters into the countries when it stretched forth its hand upon the countries. So it enters in all the countries of the world. And by the time it gets to the last country in the world, whatever country that's going to be, it's now instigated a worldwide Sunday law completely. So what I've done here, I've put the national Sunday law as a single event, beginning in America and ending in the last country. Okay, so I've called it one national Sunday law. But we know it starts in America and then the rest of the world. And sometimes we think of it as having two steps, step 1 and step 2. That's how most people understand it. There are two national Sunday laws. First in America, then the world. Okay? But another way of looking at it is that America's the first country of the world, and then you go through all the countries of the world and it ends in the last country. So you have the first country and the last country. But there's one national Sunday law for every single country. Does that make sense? So when you look at it from that perspective, you can see that the Sunday law is a single event, and once it does the Sunday law at the last country, it's then reached the same fulfillment as it did in this point of its history, and it rules supremely. Does that make sense? So this would be 42 and 41, enters the glorious land here, enters into the world there, the countries, and then you would have verse 43 here. When it does that, then it's got the treasures, then it's got all the military strength in this part here. Does that make sense? Okay, so you can see modern papal Rome is following the same sequence. The national Sunday law right at the beginning of its history, and the national Sunday law right at the end, right at the beginning of its history. Can you see the identical format here? The pattern is identical. So we know very clearly, the sequence of events in a very detailed fashion. We know that the Sunday law is going to happen as a single event essentially, and then it's going to rule supreme. There's something going to happen in this history. And because all these histories are following the same sequence of events, we can make application that whatever happens in this history is going to happen in this history, because this history plus this history gives us this history. So all we want to do is, if you want to know what verse 43 looks like, just go back to this history and that history, and it's going to tell you what the world is going to be like in verse 43. Does that make sense? Okay, so the thing is, pagan Rome makes its national Sunday law towards the end of its history, just before it's going to come to its end. Papal Rome makes it right at the beginning. So why is it in this history it's all at the front? Where does this tie into? Okay, so let's try and address that issue. It gets a bit complex now. I'm going to draw this timeline again, but I'm going to simplify it. Okay, and I'm going to draw it over here. Then I'm going to erase it because I'm not going to make any further comment on it. So I'm going to collapse 1, 2 and 3 as a single event. Okay? In fact, I'm not even going to do that. Let me do this. I'm going to collapse all of these just as the beginning of its timeline. Okay? And I'm going to start here, and we're going to say National Sunday Law, okay, USA. Right? So I've got this 1 and 2. So 1 is the first step, the breakdown of the Soviet Union. Then you begin the National Sunday Law, okay? And then, I think, I'll use the terminology, the loud cry ensues, the 144,000 begin to do their work, and they begin to the cry of the fourth angel's message when it says, "Come out of her, my people," and now the third angel's message is begins to be given to the world, okay? And we're still going to have the close of probation. So when is the next Sunday law after the United States going to be formed? Okay, so we'll have another Sunday law there. Okay, then another one, then another one, then another one. Now I don't know how many countries there are in the world. 250? There's over 200. 250 might be the number. So I would have 250 strokes here. Okay, when is the last one going to be? Would it be all tucked in here, and then this big gap as I've shown here, or not? I'm not going to follow through with the argument, but I'm going to suggest that these Sunday laws are going to occur like this, and right at the end there's going to be I'm going to call this the first, and I'm going to call this the last. We know the country of the first, but we don't know the country of the last. So the last National Sunday Law, we don't know who the country is going to be. It's country X. But you see that the last National Sunday Law is going to be very close to its end. So modern papal Rome is 1 plus 2. Here's number 2 in the sense that it follows this history, and here's number 1 in the sense that it follows pagan Rome's history. So you see, even in the National Sunday Laws being offset, this one very close to the